Okay, it's 8 o'clock. In the event of emergency evacuation, alarm will sound. Everyone should leave the building in their stairwell in a safe, efficient manner. If your stairwell is blocked by smoke, use the other stairwell. Do not use the elevator. Once you've reached the main floor, follow the exit signs to exit the building. Quickly proceed away from the building. Be mindful of others evacuating in emergency vehicles. At this time, I'll ask Madam Clerk to call the roll.
Akers. Allen.
Present.
Archer.
Yep.
Bowers.
Here.
Carter.
Here.
Carver. Caskey.
Here.
Taylor. Cole. Crowe.
Here.
Daly. Farmer. French.
Likewise.
Lambert. Lewis.
Here.
Melton.
Here.
Miller. Present. Monroe. Here. Moon.
Present.
Samples.
Here.
Stinnett.
Here.
We have 14 present, 7 absent.
14 present. Thank you, Madam Clerk. We have quorum. Call for a special meeting of the Blount County Board of Commissioners be held in room 433 at Blount County Courthouse, Court Street, Maryville, Tennessee, on Friday, August 5th, 2016 at 8 a.m. I, Mayor Ed Mitchell, pursuant to and in accordance with the authority vested in me by Tennessee Code annotated 55105, hereby call the Blount County Board of Commissioners, Blount County, Tennessee, for a call meeting to hear a report and presentation from PFM regarding the county's debt and refinancing options on August 5, 2016, 8 a.m. This time I'll recognize Randy Vineyard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all y'all coming this morning. Since I've been here, I don't know if there's been anything that's generated any more conversation than debt. Good, bad, or indifferent. And the issue that you deal with in our business is you're balancing things at all times. Current needs, future needs, current circumstances, and it's never really simple, it's never really easy. You're going to hear a report from Lauren this morning, and I would ask if you hold any questions and let her complete her presentation. Some of what you're going to see is decisions were made before many of you all ever came on commission. And you never had the luxury of starting with a blank slate. So you're always dealing with circumstances and decisions that have been made in the past, and now you're dealing with markets that today don't resemble what the markets were when many of those decisions were made. So that constrains you, and you don't always get the luxury of being able to do things with a blank slate. So again, thank you for being here. Lauren Lowe is our financial advisor from PFM. PFM is Public Financial Management, and I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren.
And Randy, I have the presentation book listed. If it's okay, I'll just put them here.
All right.
As Randy hands those out, the presentation you'll see in front of you is the same as in the booklet. Some of the information may be a little bit challenging to read on the screen just because of numbers and graphics and so forth. So that's one reason you have it printed out in front of you. So a couple of intro slides as we get started here, and forgive me, I may take a few sips of water as I continue to talk through this. Are the same slides and discussion points that I had with you all several months ago. Some of you may recall that I met with the same group back in the middle of October, talked about this plan in terms of looking at the entire debt portfolio of the county holistically, not looking at individual pieces, and looking for opportunities. How can we take this debt to the future, mitigate risk, and do so at the lowest cost possible? And so I'll kind of walk through that just in a little bit. Before I get into that, though, I will tell you that this meeting was in middle of October. We then met with the state, Randy and I did, and talked through the exact same presentation. We weren't asking anything of the state at that point, but just more for informational purposes for them. We know that anything we do in the future, we will be walking with the state, meaning they will have to be involved all along. So they have not seen this presentation. Our intent is to share this with them after this meeting. So let me talk through the summary of the engagement in terms of what we started out doing at middle of last year, if you will. We're asked to look at the debt that the county has issued since 2013 and figure out kind of what can we do to restructure this debt with these objectives in mind. Reducing the variable rate exposure to approximately 20% or as close as we can get to. This actually would conform to your debt management policy. We are asked to look at, is there opportunities to restructure the amount of variable rate debt that would be outstanding once you have 4 interest rate swaps, and I'm going to go into all that detail here in a minute. Once those swaps are gone, making sure that you are protected in any interest rate environment. Try to create a more level debt service structure. So when I refer to level debt service, I like it to mortgage style, right? Principal and interest, where you have a level payment. And then obviously be mindful of, this is a Tennessee code reference here that came into effect in 2014 on balloon indebtedness. The state is really focused on making sure debt is not balloon indebtedness in the future, where it is interest only and then some form of a balloon payment in the future. So being mindful of that and how any option we pursue, we have to comply with the state law and bring the state into fold. So let me tell you what's happened since 2013. This is all the same information we covered in October. As of June 30, 2013, the county had 48% of variable rate debt with 5 interest rate swaps. 7 pieces of your debt were associated with loan agreements with public building authorities and required third-party agreements. In late 2013, the county successfully removed the need for third-party agreements on 2 series of bonds, which resulted in annual administrative savings. This debt was placed with U.S. Bank for 3 years. So that was variable rate debt that was with public building authorities, which is still general obligation debt of the county, and required third parties to be involved to keep the bonds in the market. They were variable rate debt. We moved those away, and we placed them directly with U.S. Bank for 3 years. So if that was 2013, here we are at 2016. That's 3 years later for us to revisit that piece of debt. That did result in annual administrative savings because we removed third parties that had to be in the fold when they were placed. In 2015, the county refinanced one of the PBA loans that was still referred above, and they did so. When doing so, they refinanced it, terminated a swap. It was variable rate debt, terminated the swap, and entered into fixed rate debt, and it was level debt service, so mortgage style principal and interest. As of today, the county has 40% of variable rate debt outstanding, 4 interest rates and 4 interest rate swap agreements. There's still 4 series of bonds associated with the public building authority. Those do not carry the same level of administrative fees as the ones who we took out earlier, because those are fixed rate debt. So there's one piece of variable rate debt that we're going to talk about, but it has 4 swaps on it. So we started down this process in October, talked to the state about this opportunity that we were looking at all the debt, and then we were notified in January that Deutsche Bank, and we're going to refer to them as DB, that's the swap counterparty. So a swap is just a contract, if you will, between the county and another party, and it's Deutsche Bank in this particular case. There's technically, and I'm going to go through this in more detail, 6 swaps. 4 that are related to the county debt and 2 that are related to the hospital debt. All of them are with Deutsche Bank. So in January, we were notified that Deutsche Bank was downgraded from A3 to Baa1. And so we communicate to the county, this is something we should be mindful of. So your counterparty on this agreement, their credit quality has deteriorated. It doesn't mean anything's going to happen to the contract. In fact, they're still working within the confines of the contract as it is. But we should be mindful of it. Then, Deutsche Bank was downgraded again at the end of May to Baa2. Once they hit that Baa2 level, it became a termination event, meaning that Deutsche Bank was not holding up their end of the bargain. The county has to have a minimum rating, which is their credit quality, and so does DB. And so in this particular case, once it went from Baa1 to Baa2, and just to be clear, that's a lower credit rating, it became a termination event where they weren't holding up their end of the bargain. So at that point, we consulted with the county and with their counsel and talked about what our options are. In reviewing the contract, Deutsche Bank had the option within 30 days to actually transfer the contract to another provider with a higher credit rating. We allowed them the 30 days. We did not contact them because it's on their will if they want to do that. And if they did it, then they would be in compliance with the contract. They opted not to exercise that option. So after 30 days, so at the end of June, we reconvened and talked about what the options are. That's what we have laid out here for you. So I will say that as we think about these options, be mindful that right now, based on market conditions, the contracts are in favor of Deutsche Bank, meaning the value of the contracts today are in favor of DB, that if we were to cancel them today, we owe them money, they don't owe us money. So if it was the reverse of that, we would be much more focused on this because they owed us money. At this point, we owe them money. The contracts are in their favor. So while credit quality is certainly something we don't want to be, shy about talking, this is a very important point. We look at it slightly differently when the value of the contracts are in the favor of the party who's being downgraded. So when we went through all the options for the county and are mindful of those in every scenario we talked through. So we can transfer the contracts to another provider with a better rating than that reference up there, the Baa2. It is customary in the market that if we transfer those to a higher rated party, that Deutsche Bank would help cover some of the costs of that transfer, just from legal costs and so forth. That's because that was the termination event. That was their problem. That's something that they did. So it's very customary for them to cover those costs. And you would find a provider that would take the nuts and bolts of the contract as it is. The other option is number two, is to terminate the contracts with Deutsche Bank altogether at a discount because of this termination event. We have determined by reviewing the values of the contracts and current market conditions, to terminate at a discount, it's going to be about $500,000 in discount to the county's 4 swaps and about $500,000 in discount to the 2 swaps associated with the hospital. You can also go back to Deutsche Bank and negotiate a lower fixed rate. So if you remember, we pay them a fixed rate and they pay us a variable rate. So you can go to them and say, look, your credit quality is diminished. I want to reduce my interest rate. What they're going to tell you is, sure, we'll do that at some small amount. But in response to that, we're going to say that our rating can be something even below that Baa2. So they're going to want you to get comfortable with a lower rated credit to them. And if you can't come to terms altogether with any of those numbers 1 through 3, there's number 4 built in the documents where you could go out and actually price out the termination of the contract. If you couldn't come to terms with Deutsche Bank, you go through like a competitive process, which is referred to market quotation. This is our least favorite option just because once it's out there for bid, you have to take it. So we really would want to pursue 1 and 2 primarily because we think that the exposure to Deutsche Bank is one that we should be mindful of. All right, so let me talk about what this is. There's a couple times where I say the same thing over and over again. I just want to be mindful of through the whole presentation. The county has 7 series of bonds that can be refinanced for savings. So let me talk about this. This is, when we talk about looking at the profile of the county altogether, we looked at every piece of debt that's outstanding for the county. There are 7 pieces of debt that have savings, just pure interest rate savings. So there's fixed rate debt that was issued in markets where rates were higher, and now you can refinance them for savings. So we were mindful of this the whole time. I'll go through details of that. Then there was 2 series of bonds issued in 2013 that I talked about earlier to remove those third parties and save administrative costs. Let me talk about the hospital piece first because we're going to go into detail about it first and then go to the counties. So there's hospital revenue bonds that have a county backstop to it, so that's why in everything we do, it involves the county and the hospital in those conversations. They entered into a note with JP Morgan for 3 years that will expire in December of 2013. That piece of debt also has 2 interest rate swaps with Deutsche Bank. At the same time, the county entered into a piece of debt with US Bank for 3 years, and it has 4 interest rate swaps. So these were the focal points for us when we started through this process, was to focus on these 2 pieces of debt because of the looming December timeframe, and then be mindful of the refinancings that the county had. And then with the Deutsche Bank downgrade, we sort of had to reconfigure and look at every opportunity for the Deutsche Bank exposure and how we can eliminate it. So let me talk to you about the hospital debt first. The hospital has a note with JP Morgan that has about $79 million outstanding. It's variable rate debt and has 2 interest rate swaps with Deutsche Bank on it. Right now, I'll walk through the graphics because they make the points of the 2 little small bullets here. This is the way that the hospital debt pays off. The blue bars represent principal and the gray bars represent interest. So it does look more like a mortgage style structure in terms of payment schedule, with a slight increase between 20 and 21. But they are paying principal and interest every year until the final payment date in 2029. Right, and then that's just that's the principal and interest component of this piece of debt. This piece over here is comparing the principal payment on the debt to the interest rate swaps or those contracts with Deutsche Bank. So the blue bars represent actual principal payments, that the hospital's making each year. The gray bars represent the swaps, these contracts, and what they assume you're making payments out of. So in all cases, we prefer them to be aligned to each other because those contracts are in place to protect you from interest rates moving up and down. So you want them to be stacked next to each other. So right now, that piece of debt does have exposure to the variable rate market of approximately $23 million. But as we're moving in time, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller up until 2024, in which the contracts and the swaps, the debt outstanding match each other perfectly. So the reason why we like these to match is that if interest rates move one way or the other, you're protected by the contract. That's the intent of the contract. All right, so knowing that was the scenario that we're going to look at for the hospital, once DB was downgraded, we realized, well, we have to look at everything for the hospital as well. So what we looked at in this particular scenario is that we looked at terminating the 2 swaps with Deutsche Bank. We assumed that to terminate those swaps, you've got to cover the costs associated with doing so, and then you have to issue taxable debt to cover those costs. Everything would be fixed rate debt going forward, and we structured the new debt proportional to the old debt. So what you have is the blue bar represents what the hospital would have paid on that debt. The yellow line, if you will, is what they would have to pay if they were to terminate those contracts and issue fixed rate debt in today's market. It results in an expense of about 8.58% compared to what they would have paid, or an expense of $6.7 million in today's dollars. We reviewed this option with the county and with the hospital. So, the considerations for the hospital debt. In December of 13, that's when we entered into the private placement or the note with JP Morgan. That agreement will mature or expire in December of 16, at which point they will have to make a full payment or extend their contract or agreement with JP Morgan. Given that there are 2 interest rate swaps with Deutsche Bank, who has now been downgraded, we are mindful of that through the whole process. But due to the expense associated with terminating those swaps, the county and the hospital are exploring the option to transfer those swaps to a higher rated provider, as we mentioned earlier. We would be looking to JP Morgan to extend the facility with the hospital. We've had some conversations with JP. Obviously, this meeting here will set the tone for future conversations with JP Morgan. They understand we are meeting today to talk about this. And then also, so that takes care of the debt piece that you would talk to JP Morgan about an extension. And then the swap piece, we would start looking at options to transfer those swaps to another provider with Deutsche Bank covering the costs associated with the transfer. All right, so let me talk about the county debt. This is a much larger holistic approach because the county has those seven pieces of debt that make sense to refinance for savings. So on page 12, this is a snapshot of all of the debt the county has. It does not include the hospital debt because we just covered that piece and it's covered by hospital revenues. I'm not going to go through each individual series, if you will, but what we have included for you is the series name, whether or not they're GO bonds or GO refunding, but they all have the GO pledge, their tax status, the amount issued, the date in which they were issued, and the final payment date, and then the amount outstanding. This section over here to the right, next call date, is what's relevant to this future discussion I'm going to have with you all. When we talk about call date, current, advance, those are the ones that were sold with an opportunity to refinance in the future. If it says current, that means you can refinance them today with just a 30-day notice to your bondholders. If it says advance, you've got to give them a longer window of time to notify them, but you can still pay it off and establish an escrow to make those payments, and that's where you have the debt. So all of the candidates or all the series of bonds highlighted gray, those are the ones that make sense to refinance for savings. So if you will, that's the 7 series of bonds that I referred to earlier. The 2013 Bs are the highlighted blue. Those are the ones that we're very mindful of because of the U.S. Bank agreement that needs to be extended and has the interest rate swaps associated with it. So let me talk to you a little bit more about the refunding candidates. 6 of them are tax exempt. 1 is a taxable series, and they can all be refunded for interest rate savings based on the current market conditions. Here's the list of the refunding candidates that we have identified. When looking at this, we realized, well, this is an opportunity for us to look at a holistic approach, because the savings associated with those series above could offset the cost of terminating the swaps and getting out of the 13Bs in that variable rate mode. So looking to partner them together so that the impact of the county is as minimal as possible. So it's everything you're going to see in the next 3 scenarios takes all that into consideration. Right now, market conditions say if we just refunded those 7 series of bonds up there, you would save approximately 8.2% or $4.7 million in today's market. The final maturity of all of the debt of the county is 2037. We're not suggesting or any of these scenarios have any extensions of debt by any means. Also, each piece in there, like the 04s, the 05s, and 11s, and so on, we're not looking to extend those either. So staying with not only within the 2037 window, but also staying within their own individual original amortization for payment schedules. So here's, I think we talked through this before, but let me give you some considerations as to why the 13Bs, because of their variable rate nature, because there is swaps associated with them, they have so many other considerations. So bullet maturity, what does that mean? If the county takes no action in a variable rate piece of debt, you have a large balance that you have to pay at the end of the agreement with U.S. Bank. That's no different than any other variable rate piece of debt that the county's ever had. You always have this bank that says, I'm not going to lend you the money for 15, 20 years, I'm going to lend it for a shorter period of time. And at that shorter period of time, you either negotiate with me to extend it, find another provider, or you have to make the full payment. That's very customary in this market. So it's something we're very mindful of, because with that does come risk. We have to be mindful of market conditions will change, banks' appetites will change, personnel will change, credit quality changes. So that's always in the back of our mind and looking at all these options. Counterparty risk. This has obviously become extremely relevant here recently with the Deutsche Bank downgrade. It also means that when you have those contracts with a party, not only do they have to hold their end of the bargain, we have minimum rating requirements we have to have. And thank goodness the county has maintained those. But if the county was to, for some reason their rating were to change, it could be a situation where Deutsche Bank says you don't hold up your end of the bargain. So this is something to be mindful of, that is a component of variable rate debt with swaps. Interest rates. Interest rates can move, and the swaps are there to protect you, but and the way your current portfolio is structured, it doesn't protect you entirely. We're very mindful of that, and the idea of a swap is to protect you, and if it doesn't do that, then it hasn't really served its purpose. The administrative component of this is that those bank agreements are short-term. They're 3, maybe 5 years, and so that means that we're having to look at this every 3 to 5 years. I actually don't prefer to come up here and talk to you every 3 to 5 years and talk about needing to extend with the bank. I don't think you want to hear that from me. But it's something that we need to be mindful of, is that that's the way these facilities work. The cost. Cost in terms of if you wanted to, so these 4 blocks all sound pretty significant considerations, if you will, but there's a cost associated to get out of all of this. So there's a cost of terminating those contracts, and that's the biggest component. That's where we're seeing the drag on these options. So we're very mindful of that. I mean, yes, everybody says let's get out of it today, but they're maybe not to consider the costs associated with doing so. All right, so here's more on the 13Bs. I'm going to this is a lot of information, but I really want to walk through it. It's very important. So it's a variable rate piece of debt with 4 swaps. The value of those swaps, or the value of that agreement in today's market, is $15.2 million in favor of Deutsche Bank. So that's what I talked about earlier, that if we wanted to cancel that agreement today, we owe them $15.2 million, not them owe us. That's why their credit quality, while we're very mindful of it, we owe them money, not the other way around. That was as of July 11th, 2016. There's $79.4 million with U.S. Bank. It's a variable rate piece of debt with the 4 swaps associated with it. Those swaps actually go away in 2030, and I'm going to cover this chart in just a minute. When the swaps go away, they completely mature, there's $45.5 million of variable rate debt that has no swap associated. So you have had these contracts in place all this time, and they go away, and you have $45 million that's exposed to variable rate interest wherever the market is in 2030. All of the debt is paid off in 2037. Let me focus on this one because this speaks to this next to last bullet. This is the debt service payments, and just for consistency, remember we talked about the hospital piece of debt earlier, it's the same format. The blue bars represent principal payment on your debt, while the gray bars represent interest. You will note that 17 through 2024, there is next to no principal being paid on this debt. It's practically interest, it is interest only, I think, from 2020 to 2024. Maybe 20, I can't quite tell. These payments that are in 2017, 18, 19 are roughly $100,000. And then you start seeing where we have pretty significant interest principal payments, in comparison to before, and then a significant spike here in 2029. Now, when you layer it into the entire portfolio of the county, you don't see this big spike, but just because it's a holistic of all the debt. But we are very mindful of the fact that that is a cost to just pay interest and no principal when looking at this. Not to mention that if you're not making any principal payments, how does that look in comparison to your swaps? Same format that we covered earlier with the hospital. These blue bars represent your principal payment that you're making on the debt, and we want those blue and gray bars, which gray represents what the contract thinks you're paying, you want them to line up. They don't align at all right here or at all back here. This is my biggest focus, if you will, and that's why it has the gold bar around it. We call it the tail, because you've gone through this whole period, if you do nothing with your swaps, and in 2030 they all go away, and that $45 million of principal, you're still going to have to make those payments of principal, but it's exposed to variable rate market, whatever the interest rate environment is in that point. All right, so the 13Bs, they were entered into a private placement, a note, if you will, with U.S. Bank. That agreement also matures in December of 16, which started this entire process of looking at this debt last year. At that point, you can look to extend the debt with U.S. Bank, or you can look to refinance the debt some other way. The 4 interest rate swaps are all with Deutsche Bank. And when we looked at all these scenarios, the focal point was to reduce the variable rate debt exposure. We talked about that tail, if you will, and now reduce the exposure to Deutsche Bank given their credit quality, and look to utilize those savings from those deals that make sense to refinance for interest rate savings, to offset trying to accomplish those first 2 bullets. Here's scenario A. We refer to it as level refunding debt service. So we refunded all of those series of bonds for savings. That's the option that we're focused on here. We did leave several pieces of debt outstanding because those don't make economic sense and we don't want to actually do anything that costs the county money. We've included that list here. We terminated all of the swaps, all 4. Have to do so with taxable debt. And we went to focus on, if you're going to refinance all of those pieces of debt, don't extend the debt, refund the 13Bs, because that's the ones that tied to the variable, swaps, and cover the costs associated with the swaps. We did account for the $500,000 discount that we expect to be based on market conditions because of Deutsche Bank's downgrade. We structured it as level debt service, so it looked like mortgage style, if you will, principal and interest. This is what the new bar is, the orange color is the debt service that we came up with after doing that transaction or that scenario. The reason why it has the bump here is because there's already debt that we didn't refinance because that debt would cost you money to refinance. You wouldn't want to do it. So it's stacked on top of where you are. So what that scenario did, it was, if you looked at it on a standalone basis, it would look flat, but it's stacked on top of existing debt. The blue bars represent what you would have paid if you had not done this transaction. So what you'll recognize very early on is to do scenario A is at an additional cost. Additional cost in annual debt service. What you gain from doing this would, you actually pick up debt capacity back here where you did not once have it, specifically in this area, but at a cost of additional debt service in years 2017 through 2021. The engagement criteria that we were tasked with is accomplished, meaning we reduced all the variable rate exposure, took out all that debt. We also got rid of all the swaps, but at a cost. So when looking at this with the county, with Randy and his team, they're very mindful of this additional cost and how that would be something to be mindful of and considerate of looking at additional scenarios. So we came up with another scenario that we wanted to talk through with this group. Scenario B, refund the tail. And if you remember, that's that piece of debt that I'm very focused on the back end, and if you do nothing, you'll eventually have exposure to the interest rate market. $45 million has no swap tied to it. So what this does is it was just to be a little bit more, we reduced the amount of criteria that we actually accomplished here, and let me walk through what we did. We said, let's refund. By the way, all those refundings for savings are always in here. They're all built into this scenario. But focusing on the 13 Bs and those 4 swaps, we look to refund $39 million of that 45. So it would leave you with a balance of $6 million of variable rate exposure. We picked $39 million because one of the swaps has a value or a notional amount of $39 million. It also has the highest interest rate on it. So we would terminate $39 million swap and refinance $39 million of debt. And we would look to structure the debt, the new debt, proportional to the old, so that you don't have any of those significant increases of annual debt service right in here. That would mean that you would have to negotiate with U.S. Bank a smaller loan or a smaller note for the extension. It would not be $79 million and now be $40 million. This particular scenario results in a small present value savings of about 1.5% or $1.5 million. And you can't even visually see it on here because it's so minimal in terms of where your debt is today. So the blue bars represent what you would have paid. The purple is the new scenario that we did. It was limited impact on the engagement criteria because you still have $6 million of variable rate debt exposure, but I will say that's a significant reduction from $45 million. One swap was terminated, but not the other 3, so it still remains outstanding. And then we did look, it's not a level debt service in terms of your aggregate portfolio, but as we went through this with the county, they were very mindful of the additional cost, so that this is not looking like a level debt service or a descending slope of debt, but it's proportional to where you were. And the one thing is to just be mindful of that would require an extension with U.S. Bank for another 3 years, and you have to continue that process that I talked about, the 3 to 5 year window in which the bank's going to want to renew. We would have to also on this point, we're going to cover it here, but on the next slide, is that because there's still 3 swaps, you have to transfer them to another provider. So similar to the concept we talked about with the hospital debt. So comparing those same graphics that we talked about earlier, let me show you. This is what it looked like when I showed it to you on the previous slide. So remember, we were trying to align those blue bars and gray bars. The gray bars over here, you'll see that's where the swaps make you think you're making all these payments, and the blue bars represent your actual interest principal payments on that debt. This is the before and after. So after, we've gotten much closer to an alignment, if you will, between the 3 swaps that would be outstanding and the principal payments that need to be made under the U.S. Bank agreement. This piece right here is that $6 million of variable rate debt exposure that you would still have. If you remember earlier, it was that big circle and it was $45 million. So Randy and us, we said, let's look at something else. Let's look at this and see how can we, because we were so focused on trying to get rid of all the swaps, variable rate debt entirely, and that scenario B really only partially accomplished that. So that's for scenario C, and we refer to this as minimize annual debt service, because scenario A did do all that, but at a cost in terms of annual debt service. So scenario C refunds all the debt, just like all the other scenarios, for interest rate savings. All 4 swaps are terminated with taxable debt. And here's the significant difference between these options. One is on structure and one is on contribution. Before, we were on scenario A, we were very focused on creating this level debt service structure on the new debt, but because it created a hump, because it had to sit on top of your old debt, this scenario said, well, we got to look at it as how can we make it proportional to what you would have paid? So we're not going to accomplish we're not gaining any debt capacity in the future, but we're very mindful of additional costs. So this one it's very similar to what you would have paid. This also assumes a cash contribution of $5 million from the county into this transaction. The results are a slight expense of 0.55% or $760,000, if you will, net of the $5 million that you have to put into this scenario to make this yellow line work proportional to the existing debt. So this gets rid of all of the variable rate debt, all the swaps, to do so to where it's minimal impact to the county in the near term. There's a use of $5 million. All variable rates gone, all swaps are gone, and the aggregate debt service looks virtually unmodified to what you would have paid. The reason why we can accomplish this with $5 million, because as I mentioned earlier, the cost of the swaps is $15 million, is because we're using those refinancings for savings to offset the cost. So let me go through the individual scenarios with you and what we're focused on when we think about considerations and outcomes, favorable and non-favorable. So scenario A, if you will, that's the one where we get rid of everything. We do a level debt service structure, so mortgage style, but it has a cost, meaning an immediate impact to your annual debt service cost, but creates capacity in the future. So let me go through these one all the way down the list. Okay, eliminates bullet maturity with U.S. Bank. Yes, it gets rid of that, meaning we don't have to refinance with U.S. Bank now or in the future at all. Eliminates one or more swaps. Yes, in fact, that one gets rid of all 4 swaps. Reduces variable rate debt to a manageable level. Yes, it actually gets rid of all variable rate debt that the county has. Requires taxable debt or cash contribution. Yes, that's a non-favorable outcome. Yes, it does. It requires us to issue taxable debt. In this scenario, we didn't use any cash, just so you know. But it requires taxable debt to get out of the contracts with Deutsche Bank. Requires note extended to be with U.S. Bank, but that's not relevant anymore because we no longer are working with U.S. Bank. Has exposure to variable rate debt market, not applicable because all variable rate debt's gone. Requires one or more swaps to be transferred, not applicable because they're all taken out. Increase in near-term annual debt service. Yes, that's a consideration, and it was a non-favorable outcome from that scenario. Scenario B is where we only refinance a smaller portion, no cash contribution. Refinance a smaller portion but to keep the debt consistent to where it was going to be. So, in terms of eliminates bullet maturity with U.S. Bank, let me be mindful, I should have actually put something there, is that it doesn't eliminate it, so it should be now I think I should put non-applicable, but that's not necessarily the case. You do get rid of the bullet maturity here, and you're going to extend it with U.S. Bank. You have to be mindful that's a continuation with U.S. Bank or some other bank going into the future. Eliminates one or more swaps. Yes, it eliminates one, but not all 4. Reduces the variable rate debt to a manageable level. Yes, I believe it does because it's $44.5 million now, or 45.4, excuse me. And in the future, it would only be $6 million. That's a drastic reduction from a credit perspective and exposure to the markets. Requires taxable debt or cash contribution. Yes, in that particular case, you would have to issue a small taxable piece of debt to take out that one swap. Requires the note to be extended with U.S. Bank. That's a non-favorable outcome. Yes, it will now and in the future. You'll have to require some extension. Now it's a smaller amount. Right now it's $79 million. It would only be $40 million going forward. But still, something very to be mindful of. Exposure to variable rate debt. Yes, there's still exposure to $6.9 million right there. Requires one or more swaps to be transferred because of Deutsche Bank. Yes, 3 swaps will have to be transferred to another provider. It does not include, no increase to your near-term annual debt service because that piece of debt is structured proportional to what it looks like now. Scenario C, this is the one that was referred to as minimized annual debt service cost. That's refunding all 4 swaps, refunding all the variable rate debt. So eliminate the bullet maturity with U.S. Bank. Yes, no need to extend now with them or in the future. They will no longer be party to any agreements with the county. Eliminates one or more swaps. Yes, it actually eliminates all 4. Reduces variable rate debt to a manageable level. Yes, it reduces all variable rate debt. Requires taxable debt or cash contribution. In this particular case, it's very significant here, so I want to make sure that scenario does require some level of taxable debt to refinance the swap, and also did include that use of $5 million of cash from the county to get to that proportional debt service, so it doesn't hit you in your annual debt service cost. The next three are not applicable because they're related to a U.S. bank extension, variable rate debt, and swaps. All of that would go away. And then obviously, because of the cash contribution, it does not increase your near-term annual debt service. Here's a graphic of the three scenarios for you all to see kind of a visual of it, and why when we first started looking at scenario A, the county was very mindful of the additional costs in the near term. So with a focus for B and C to be more proportional so that there's not an additional annual debt service cost to the county. So let me talk a little bit about next steps before I turn it over to Randy. We'll start with the hospital. So everything the hospital is looking at, the county is involved in. So we're walking hand in hand on this, looking at that debt. Both parties will be involved in any discussions going forward. Suggestion here would be to work with JP Morgan on the option to extend that 13 note that's with the hospital. That's the one that's due in December. Look to other swap counterparties to transfer those two agreements away from Deutsche Bank because of their credit quality. And look to Deutsche Bank to talk to them about the cost of doing that, because there'll be legal expense and so forth that they would cover. And as I mentioned, it's very customary in the market. It is a negotiation point, though, in terms of the discussions with them. The state will be involved in all steps of the way to make sure that they are aware of what the county and the hospital are doing. They'll want to understand the extension with JP Morgan and the transferring of any swaps. On the county debt alone, and this obviously doesn't include the hospital, we want to walk through each one of these scenarios with the state. We want them to ask questions, be involved. They will be integral to anything we do going forward. They have to approve just about anything we do, no matter what. Work with Deutsche Bank on termination discounts. So that's also a negotiation point, and as I mentioned, we have estimated the $500,000 discount if you terminate all four. To further those conversations and actually have them directly with Deutsche Bank. At this point, we wanted to have this conversation with the commission before we talked to Deutsche Bank, obviously. But so we can get a better sense for that $500,000 discount. Can it be more? Can it be less? Those kind of conversations based on market conditions. And then obviously proceed with the necessary approvals for any scenario selected, because the county commission will have to approve, the state will have to approve at multiple levels. So just kind of get the ball rolling, because December will be here before we know it. So just moving forward into the future pretty quickly, if you will. So with that, I'll let Randy wrap it up before we close.
There's a lot of effort went into what you didn't see. This is where we kind of narrowed it down and focused on what we think are the best options for the county. If I look at what the mayor charged me with when I got here, I think scenario C probably comes the closest to addressing all of his concerns, and I think the county's concerns, frankly, the variable rate exposure. I would hate to think when my time's up here that we'd still have $45 million worth of unhedged variable rate debt for the county to be exposed to. It makes no sense to me. And we've got some options right now that I think we don't have to do that. So I'm leaning toward option C. It is a function, and we can't lose sight of this, of the marketplace. So we've got an election coming up in November. I think we'll probably have some stable financial markets until that time at least. We don't have to worry about the outcome of the election, whatever that's going to be, it's going to be. But if we can get the approval process in place, and it's going to require some decisions on your part, not the least of which, if you support scenario C, then we have a policy in place on the debt service fund balance that says we as a community want to have a fund balance in our debt service fund equal to 1 year's worth of debt service payments. We're not there yet, but if you'll remember my comment about balance, we have to balance our perspectives and our issues. Is it worth taking $5 million in cash out of fund balance to make scenario C happen? And I can't answer that question for you. I think that's a prudent decision in our case. Scott does the best he can do to earn interest on the county's assets, and we're getting, what, 30 basis points at best? 35, wow. No offense to him, but that's the market we're in. So, With that, I'll turn it over to the chair, and then we're here to answer questions as you may see fit.
Thank you, Mr. Vineyard. Thank you, Lauren, for bringing this presentation. Are there any questions at this time? This is Commissioner Monroe.
Originally, we were told that the variable rate was going to be 37.5%, and then when you did the presentation, you said it was 39, and now you're saying it's 40.
Yeah, I can address. In fact, it's probably best to see it on a graphic. Every year that we move into the future, this becomes more prevalent because the swaps just think you're making payments that you're not making on your debt. So that meaning they were covering you in terms of your interest rate exposure, and as you take, they think you're making. The contracts make or have this built in that you're making these payments, which you're really not. They can actually increase over time. We don't. Yes, that's why we're and this is where it technically peaks, if you will, right here, because this amount of contract is gone or paid off. So it's not even actually here where I'm focused on. It's actually, it starts here. It's just so visible here. But those contracts are make assumptions. I'm sorry, I can't see next one. That you're making the payments here and you're not. So that's why it's increasing over time. Your amount of variable rate debt outstanding doesn't change. It's just what's covered by the swaps.
What interest rate did you assume for scenario C?
So scenario C, we assumed market conditions. I can give you an average cost of capital is the best way to refer to it. For scenario C, we have a true interest cost of a 2.71.
And that takes into account free and
Any other questions? Ms.
I have
Davis?
a question. I wanted your opinion on the German bank. I know that so much of the market is based on trust, but is your feeling that the bank is going to, if that bank goes under, we don't want to live with it?
So let me talk about what would happen, because I'll be honest, somebody asked this question 10 years ago, we'd all been like, oh, that's never going to happen. Well, then Lehman exited the market within a weekend. So we have to be mindful of it now. Let me talk about what would happen if they just completely went away. First of all, we don't know because it hasn't occurred. We also don't presume it is going to occur, but we need to talk about it. You would have no party to those contracts. So they would probably get pent up in litigation, and we would then have to probably transfer them. We have our counselor if he wants to throw anything into this. But we could transfer those to another provider. So it's not necessarily that we go down or anything like that. We would just be forced into that transfer in maybe a situation where we weren't leading the charge, and I don't think we want that, because then it becomes sort of a fire drill. The other thing is that we have to be mindful of, to make these contracts work, we pay them a fixed rate. They do make a payment to us. Now, it's a much smaller payment, and if they stop making that payment, the contracts are not there. Obviously, they're in the fault of the contract, and I don't think we want to be there either because of the litigation and the process of just going through it with them and their attorneys and so forth. So we're just trying to, I think, head off some of those concerns. At this point, I don't know enough about Deutsche Bank to say that they're here for the long haul or not. But I will say it's just something we're more mindful of. And I think, 10, 20 years ago, we didn't feel like that was going to be a situation that we'd have to face, and then we saw that it was.
Well, my problem is, if a bank that good and that big goes down, our banks are going to go down too.
In general, the entire banking industry took a significant hit. I mean, I will say it's gotten better. I don't know enough about the German bank industry to say much about that DB in themselves. But the banks that we would be looking for, if we're going to transfer hospital swaps, county swaps, any swaps, we would be focused on credit quality. We've already pulled a list of banks that are active in the swap market and what their credit quality is, and we have to have those conversations. And that's one of the biggest considerations is credit quality. That's the best way we can base our decision.
And you have fewer and fewer banks
Right.
in that market.
And with that rating, I mean, it was a much broader universe 10, 20 years ago than it is now.
Any other questions? Commissioner Monroe.
With the $5 million cash Approximately what will that leave in debt service that we can use?
In your debt service fund?
Probably $6 million.
And is any of that restricted,
It's all restricted for debt service.
but restricted for something specific?
Debt service.
Debt service.
But-
Payment of
okay, but I
interest.
mean-
Anything debt service related.
Okay.
What's our annualized debt service for, what does it cost per year for their debt or interest payment? It's in there.
Well, it's only been in the last year or so that we flipped with the last financing in 13 and 15, where we're actually retiring more principal than we're paying in interest. That's part of the evolution that we've been through to put ourselves in a better position.
On what you're calling the tail, originally were those swaps tied to the bump, the length of the debt, and then when the market got volatile, did they extend that debt out?
I wish I could answer that question. I wasn't involved in that. From what I've seen, it doesn't look like it was ever matched to it. So it never looked like the term of the debt was tied to the term of the swap. That's just from me reading the documents and so forth going back. But there's been many iterations of it. I wish I could answer it more definitively, but I can't. Meaning, I don't.
You don't know.
I wouldn't know, because this is dating back to 2008.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like it was ever tied specifically where they aligned in terms of their time frame or the payment structure that we talk about here. It doesn't look like it, but
You can go back to the original.
I mean, I can't, I have not gone back to, I have not.
Any other questions? Mr. Bowers?
Assuming we adopt scenario C, what's the effect on the tax rate or contribution to debt service? That's probably a question for Randy.
Well, C probably has the least impact on us.
Okay.
Either in debt service, tax rate, or anything else. The weakness with C, in my opinion, is it does not create debt capacity for us in the future. Scenario A probably gives us the best opportunity for any future debt capacity for any capital need we might have. And I don't know what that might be.
Right.
But all things being equal, C, I think, is probably our best option, given our current circumstances and the current financial conditions of the economy.
Members don't object, but the chair like to ask a question. Scenario A has the largest near-term cost, is that correct?
That's correct.
It accomplishes, like I say, it extinguishes all the derivatives, but gives you debt capacity in the future.
Yes, sooner. C gives you some debt capacity, but not as much as A would.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Okay, pursuant to 55105, we are adjourned